Hello, everyone. So we're live now. We're going to have the panel about the future of open tools technology, and Oscar is going to lead it, so I'll just let him get the stage.
Thank you, Rotem. Welcome, everyone, to the Open Science Room panel number 1, as Rotem said, the future of open tools / technologies. Today, we will be talking not just about open data, open software, but also open hardware. We have the pleasure to talk today with André, Maia, Chagas, Leah Waller, Eilidh MacNicol, and Chris Madan, whose expertise cover many of the aspects of today's cutting-edge open tools. We have prepared 2 questions for each of them, and if time permits, we can address the questions from the audience after that. Before we start, I'd like to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves in under 1 minute, preferably 30 seconds, as there are lots of topics to cover today. André, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So in 30 seconds, I've graduated recently at the University of Tübingen, covering aspects on how we can challenge scientific barriers in neuroscience with open source hardware. I created an initiative called Open Neuroscience, which is a website hosting different open source projects for neuroscience, where people can actually upload their own projects there for recognition and to get the word about their projects out there. And I volunteer at an NGO called Trend in Africa, where we're trying to support the development of research in Africa with workshops and tutorials. And a lot of what I do is about how can you build your own tools using open source hardware. That's me.
Thanks. Next, Leah.
Hi, my name is Leah Waller. I'm a PhD student in Berlin at the Bernstein Center in Henrik Walter Lab, and I work on meta-analysis for fMRI in the Enigma Consortium. So before that, I did some replication studies on resting state functional connectivity. And in my master's, I did electrophysiology, so that was a bit different. So my focus is a bit on applying existing methods to big data sets and dealing with kind of the resulting challenges with that. And of course, that would be really impossible without open source code. So yeah.
Thank you, Leah. Next is Eilidh.
Hi, I'm Eilidh MacNicol. I'm a postdoc at King's College London. I recently graduated from a PhD which used multimodal MRI imaging to characterize a rat model of healthy aging. My master's was in neuroimaging, and it was mostly focused on human data rather than rodents. And I found the learning curve for rodent data analysis to be quite challenging, and this has kind of spurred me to look into the options for increasing the openness of preclinical imaging and the accessibility of the existing tools to data that is not for human species.
Thank you. And finally, Chris.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Madan, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. A lot of the research that I've been doing over the last few years has been using open data, particularly to look at healthy aging and how the brain changes with that, but also to kind of contrast with dementia then as well. And then part of it is then using open data, but also developing new neuroimaging tools along the way that to kind of facilitate the questions that I'm trying to ask, but then other people can kind of apply it to different patient samples or even to other species. And that's been kind of developing along there, and some challenges and things with that is some of what I'll be talking about when it comes to be my turn.
Thank you. So I'll start with André. Thank you for being so, you all three did it in less than 30 seconds. So André, his profile was really peculiar to me because I'm rather focused on MRI of the human brain. So it was really hard for me to imagine how to change my mindset about our hardware. So we typically work with vendor MRI acquisition, where we don't have room for, do really big sophistications other than programming maybe a new MR sequence. So I understand that for MRI researchers and other neuroimaging researchers, other modalities, MEG, EEG, nuclear imaging, may not attempt to make their hardware open at once, but they can work on peripherals, right? And sometimes those are very important, almost as important as the acquisition device itself. So I was thinking about eye gaze trackers, stimuli presentation devices, motion trackers, physiological signal monitoring, etc. So can you share your views of how the OHBM community, which mainly gathers around neuroimaging, can leverage this open source hardware you propose? How do you see the evolution of the adoption of such devices? Like the examples I gave before, what are the main roadblocks we will find first?
Right. So I guess one thing that needs to be said before everything is that I guess open hardware is kind of like the new kid on the block for the open sciences, right? Or for the open science movement. Not that we haven't been developing hardware in the lab for a long time, but just like the way we do it now with proper licenses and, you know, a system to do it and a way to promote it and to share the documentation and so on. This is fairly new. And so as all new fields, it's developing, and I'm glad to say it's developing quite fast. So I hope, to answer the first part of your question, like where is it going? I hope that it's going to be the norm and not the exception really soon. From all the examples that you gave, so eye trackers and movement trackers, EKGs, EEGs, and so on, there are already open source hardware projects available out there, right? I think one that is really worth a mention is OpenBCI, which are these boards for brain-computer interfaces. Then definitely you can grab a lot of EEG, EKG signals using these boards. They can be completely portable, driven by battery. So, you know, there is a lot going on in this space of these peripherals. What I would like to say, and this is maybe to provoke some thought, is what happens if a company providing an MRI machine goes out of business, right? It's completely closed source. You might have another, 5 years out of life of that MRI, something breaks. How many institutes around the globe have this now really, really large, expensive piece of brick on their research areas, right? And then I'm saying this because the CERN, the European Center for Nuclear Research, they have thought about this problem because it's a multi-year, multi-decade, multi-country project. They make sure that everything that companies are providing to them is open source, right? So they have already outlived and they will outlive many companies. And so having these things open source really helps them not have somewhere buried in the middle of a particle accelerator a little piece of hardware that doesn't have support anymore, right? So hopefully the field will move into that direction, in the sense that even the MRI companies are going to start open sourcing their tools, and hopefully all companies can start doing that. I know it sounds dreamy, but this doesn't mean that there won't be profitable companies anymore, right? It just means that they will provide service, like you have Red Hat in software, like they're offering something that is completely easy to copy and so on, but they make billions of revenue and so on because people don't want to spend the time building an MRI machine. They just want to buy it, right? I hope that answered most of your,
Yeah, I'm going to stop you there, and I want to jump to the first question for Leah. I'm going to shuffle your questions because in the interest of time, to make sure all of you speak a reasonable amount of time. So Leah, your lab has recently posted a preprint on bioRxiv presenting HalfPipe, a software workflow for the analysis of fMRI. You are the lead developer of this project. What are the major hurdles you've sorted out in its development? What are the next computational challenges that are awaiting pipeline developers? And what are the currently missing tools?
Yeah, thank you for that interesting question. So HalfPipe is a software that we developed for the Enigma consortium to do fMRI analysis. So to take a step back, Enigma is about kind of doing meta-analysis. So we send out a data analysis pipeline to collaborators. They run it locally on their data and then send back summary statistics that we can use for meta-analysis. And then we answer the research question. So that way we kind of get about all the ethical, legal, and logistical issues of data sharing. The problem now is kind of, for example, that collaborators will sometimes not know or really care about technologies like just command line or JSON files and all these things that you kind of need if you're using current tools. But we still want to have their data in consortium analysis because it's really valuable data. And we also have collaborators that have gigantic data sets and want to use computing clusters, supercomputers, and we also need to accommodate that. So that meant kind of we needed to make a new tool, but we also wanted to use as many open standards and reuse as much existing code as possible. And kind of the biggest challenge we had was code documentation. So I think yesterday in the chat, there was this really interesting discussion about like, is it faster to re-implement a tool that is really badly documented, or is it better to painstakingly reconstruct how it works and then adopt it? And I would say, obviously, the latter is better because then you can work together as a community and make it a better tool for everyone. But I would really want that we as a community kind of have incentives for scientists, that we document our tools, and also that we document our code, meaning that we define also not just command line interfaces, but also APIs, so that people can really use the code and be modular, adopted in other parts. So that will be kind of my first answer.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into Eilidh, and maybe we can open questions later. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, as it probably won't fit the MRI board. You are indeed the best person for that. And not just because you work with rodents and maybe the elephant is scared of them, also because indeed your experience in neuroimaging began with humans. Although we have a wealth of tools to apply in our neuroimaging research workflow, most of them have traditionally ignored the application of other species. Historical reasons and funding definitely justify this problem. So let's look forward. How this problem makes it difficult to progress on non-human computational imaging. Do you think that not accounting for the gulf separating the methods between fields will slow down the generalization of mapping of knowledge obtained in non-human imaging and vice versa?
Well, I mean, just taking a step back about what the real problem is with the fact that rodents aren't being addressed is that largely the existing tools don't cater for the data types that are generated. So whether that's the fact that they have a proprietary imaging image type that has to be converted to NIFTY or MINC. And I'm laughing because you did mention that I was smiling when we were talking about dead MRI companies, when obviously that a key example is the fact that preclinical imaging is mostly a monopoly at this stage. So yeah, it's very likely that if something happened, then a lot of people would have very expensive bricks in their scanning facilities. So this has brought de facto adaptions that are not applied uniformly across labs, which causes a huge amount of heterogeneity in processing pipelines. But also they're tied together with in-house scripts, which leads to like this documentation issue that Leah was talking about. So there's a huge issue where we don't really know how to address the degree of heterogeneity, because it's also mixed up with heterogeneity in the types of animals, whether that's different strains of rats or mice or other small animal imaging, but also in lab-to-lab acquisitions. So this whole thing confuses the field, and it is probably contributing to mixed effects that we're seeing. And what this is potentially impacting is the translational ability of results to make clinical impacts, which is really the reason that we're using the animals in the first place. And you know, it also has a knock-on effect in the sense that often preclinical researchers have to spend more resources trying to reinvent the wheel. So instead of focusing on the job at hand, they have to they have to use these adaptions to make tools work when in theory they should be completely applicable, but there's some arbitrary design in the software engineering that has completely eradicated its use. These are not hard problems to solve, they're just repetitive when everyone is doing it in their own different way and in their own different to solve their own problems. So I know for a fact that it puts other researchers off contributing to the field, so particularly researchers who have a comparable experimental model in mice or rats, and they're less likely to contribute to that data and reuse the data that you know, we want to try and get as much.
You're cutting out. You're muted. So yeah, you're muted. Let's jump to Chris. If you can pick it back when we come back to you, Eilidh. I really appreciate that, but you look muted, and you are actually indeed muted. So Chris, in your 2019 paper introducing your CalcSolve toolbox, you used 3 lifespan data sets and found consistent age-related relationships for each sulcus of 2 data sets. Both were Western samples, and markedly weaker in the East Asian data set. This finding leads you to caution about the awareness of neuroimaging data. If we then bring this problem into the context of your very recent paper, Scan Once, Analyze Many, where you know that open data is already driving the development of methods, how much of a risk is that if we base the development of new tools only on weird data sets, then all these new tools will only amplify these biases? How can we, or should we, robustify the development of methods against this particular bias in the case we can't access diverse enough data for the development? Can you share your thoughts or strategies for a methods developer midway their PhD to effectively identify insufficient diversity in their test data?
Yeah, so definitely a complex question. So I guess, yeah, to slightly recap that, there's lots of different data sets that are around, and we, at the very least, should be using some degree of, at least preferably open data sets when developing new methods, or at least evaluating new methods. But yeah, the representation of what data sets are kind of open in the field is not kind of random across a lot of different parameters. There's biases such as being from Western countries. I think, at least kind of given that as a point, it would be better to evaluate across multiple data sets, or kind of a mixture, and just kind of having them all be like, especially if it's meant to be some measure that's kind of, let's say, scanner agnostic, that we're measuring some property of the brain, we should just mix them together and then maybe have some kind of hybrid data sets that, again, is still open and reproducible in terms of like, okay, is it fully these data sets, or is it some kind of weighting of like these subject IDs from this one and some other ones from some other one? But I guess another issue is to kind of think about how much is it, what is a PhD student's role in software development? So if they're developing tools as part of the kind of PhD progression, great, because they're trying to answer new questions. But in terms of production level kind of evaluation of the rigor of it to be robust to some of these biases, I think that's probably a bit too much to say is on a PhD as a software developer. To the, like, it should be well designed relative to kind of the research question and the kind of data set that's going in. Like, for instance, HCP is a rich data set. There's a lot of multimodal interesting things we can do. If it's developed fully on HCP but doesn't like demonstrate some aging effects, maybe that's fine. But preferably it's more that either the lab or preferably as a community working as a team, that it's, anyways, we have versioning. There's some version that student, let's say, initially used and kind of did their PhD work on, and maybe they do a check, let's say, some later on after some changes have been made with some further evaluation, do things still kind of reproduce across versions? But I think it's more the figuring out what is the role of each person, and kind of, again, team and more community, like not just, let's say, within a lab, and then doing those. And arguably that's just multiple papers worth, and like, okay, it was done some initially, it showed some kind of initial promise, and then was validated with some more rigor, and then kind of used on larger scales in terms of becoming a more kind of standard kind of analysis thing in the field. But those are not all to be done in one step, and more iterative, and different people first author, different people leading sections of that, and thinking, yeah, what are the goals of how generalizable should it be? So yeah, we definitely want to make tools that are robust beyond specific samples that they're initially kind of designed for, but also that shouldn't be, and like that's a bigger problem than on any individual or even on a lab.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't ask you to basically solve mentoring to all the PIs around the world, but it was more like little tricks to those who are looking at.
I think it's more figuring out what are the problems that are relevant at a given time.
But I agree with you that it's not the burden of finding out good test data for their code is not on the PhD student precisely. Let me go back to André. We have gone through halfway our time, so let's try to make it quick. You mentioned before already, you introduced licenses for hardware, and I wanted to ask you about that. First, what are common aspects between the licensing of software and hardware? Is there copyleft hardware? And then second, regarding analytical variability, openness in software has also afforded many degrees of experimental freedom to researchers. The one benefit of black boxes, and please note some quotes around benefit, is that they simplify reporting. If you report having conducted an analysis with this particular software on this specific version and with the default parameters, there's little room for misreporting, as anyone will have access to the same tool with paying the fee or the license they need to do. So the problem of analytical variability is not per se problematic if you report everything in principle, as Carp elaborated. So in the case of hardware, how all of this applies?
Okay, so that's a big one. But keeping it short. So again, the CERN has worked for a long time with licenses, right? So they have teams dedicated to like figuring out the licenses, and now they have version 2.0 of the CERN open hardware license. There are many others as well, but I think together with the CERN one, the most famous one is the Tapir, TAPIR license for hardware. And like CC licenses, they have like different levels. Creative Commons licenses, they have different levels of like, if you share, do you have to report? Do you have to share alike, and so on and so on, right? So yeah, so this is being fought by the open hardware community as well. And then about the replicability and the freedom that comes from like maybe having a piece of hardware that doesn't work as it should, I guess, right? So hardware, differently from software, has this problem that with time, it gets uncalibrated, right? And this is something that we are trying to figure out right now. For instance, if you have a PCR machine in the lab, you bought it 10 years ago, it's reporting a certain temperature. Is that still the temperature that it says it's reporting, or do you have something else, right? And we think that this might be what leads to this thing where like certain experiments are only done by a certain technician in a certain lab, which could be the machines, right? And then this is where, again, the openness of the hardware comes to help, where together with the hardware, you publish like how to calibrate your machine. So in principle, open source hardware could lead to less variability, because in principle, you could calibrate your machine before every single experiment to make sure it's always working in optimal conditions.
Thank you. Very interesting. If asked, I'd venture that you have devoted large amount of time in defining efficient interfaces between software modules to keep cohesive functionalities low. What is your opinion about the role of standards, bits derivatives in particular, to permit a seamless or transparent division of the research workflow? Finally, and apologies because I gave you this last addendum to the question very late, how do you think we will be able to compare these pipelines? Should we come up with standardized benchmarking tools? How do we decide between the increasing amount of different pipeline options? And this is very related to what André just said, right? do we need some sort of a calibration of our software?
Yes, thank you for the interesting question. So I guess for half-pipe, the challenge was that we also have a user interface, and so we also had to kind of tie that into the backend. So that made kind of software efficiency a more relevant thing. And the other interface, of course, is the bid standard, which kind of we can use to interface with like different standardized pipelines. So half-pipe, of course, the program that we published is not just, it doesn't do everything, right? It uses fMRI as a module, which kind of makes it nice because then we don't really have to ask that question right away about, okay, which one is better? Is it half-pipe or is it fMRI? That question doesn't matter because half-pipe is an add-on to something that already exists. So I think that is kind of one part of it. The other part is, of course, that we kind of want to make derivatives that different apps that work on the bid standard make. We want them to be interoperable so that if I write a script to do meta-analysis, then when the next person develops a new pipeline, then I can reuse that script and compare the pipelines. But I think the core challenge really is how do we, not how we can run our data analysis multiple times or how can we repeat it later on, as Christopher mentioned, but the question really is how can we do statistics to find out, are the differences relevant, are the differences important? So kind of these tools for multiverse analysis that I don't really think we're there yet. Maybe there's some new stuff in the literature that I don't know about. I would be really interested to hear that. But yeah, I've also heard that for fMRI, they're going to have this long-term support thing where they kind of automatically rerun the pipeline 1,000 times for each new release and look at the variation between and across releases, which I think is quite a cool thing. And oh, that's my 2 minutes.
Yep, thank you. I'm gonna quickly ask.
Oscar, sorry, just one
yes.
thing. You have 3 minutes, so I'll let you manage the time. You also
Yes.
have questions in the chat if you want to check them.
I don't see any
Whatever
questions.
whatever you decide to do with your time.
So I had 2 questions remaining for Eilidh and Chris. Maybe I can invite them to quickly go over them. For Eilidh, it was related to Chris's first point. How do you see the landscape of open data about species other than humans? Are they released under FAIR principles? And this is basically problems about harmonization. And then to Chris, I was going to ask about his last paper about the many data sets. I highly recommend to read it. And basically, I wanted to ask him about the reusability of data. Is it common about amongst open data to be released with somewhat restrictive licensing, disallowing, for example, sharing derivatives? What is your position about that? And yeah. So Chris or Eilidh, whoever wants to go next.
I'll go quickly just to say that data sharing in rodents specifically is a bit of a mixed bag. I can't speak for other experimental animals. Maybe non-human primates might have it a little bit better, but there are some data on Open Neuro, not a lot. There are some on the NIH sharing website, and then even more on personal repositories, which tend to follow FAIR guidelines in that order. So, you know, as they decreasingly accessible as you move away from sites like Open Neuro, it's mostly, I think, due to licensing that is the real issue, and a lack of awareness about how to go about licensing. And it comes from my point before about preclinical researchers having to learn how to do all the jobs when instead they could be supported by software engineers who can help them make these decisions too. And
Chris,
just, yeah.
Sorry to cut you. I have to
I'll
give it
just
to
try and
Chris
speak
last
things
minute.
really fast. So with some data sets, it's a bit mixed in terms of how sharing derivatives work. So for instance, with HCP, you're not supposed to use subject IDs in papers, and I've seen quite a few papers that have had to have corrections because they had that like in the image saying which individual this is a picture of their brain, and that had to be removed because the HCP's guidelines say not to do that. They have a different way that you can share derivatives, but it's restrictive and complicated. Whereas CamCan, a data set with aging from Cambridge, they require you to share some level of derivatives when things are published. Like whatever you've kind of newly derived should be in some sort of open access repository, and that's part of the terms of using CamCan, is that new things you make should be shared. So it's a bit of mixed in terms of which data sets. At the very least, I think it's a plus that to the degree that you can within license rules, it's great that things can be shared, because then people can start working from the same data and just continually create more from it, and then not have to rederive something that's kind of obvious in some sense, like formulaic, and take CPU hours, but it's just there, and then continue to do that rather than individual lab data sets that can't be shared for various reasons and then cannot be directly compared in terms of reproducibility of the results. So at least this is a great way, like make a new tool, don't have to rerun everything else, just compare it to kind of existing benchmarks. And I think.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Apologies to all of you because it ran out of time. But yeah, thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone. It was a great discussion. I'll have to move you off stage now. Sorry.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'll quickly invite the new speakers and we'll be ready.
Hi.
And
Hey, Kirstie, good to see you.
It's always here. I love seeing all of the sentiments and stuff. I only joined the last 10 minutes after the
Kirstie, your audio is a little like muffled or something. Maybe. Maybe say something again. Maybe.
This is me talking now. Is it still really muffled?
No, that's better. Yeah.
Oh, good. Maybe I was just mumbling.
No. Hi, Russ.
okay, we have everyone here. So hello to the lead speakers. We have a panel on building a career in the age of open science now. I'll go behind the stage just in case there are some technical problems. If you have questions, please put them on the chat and I'll let Russ moderate. Good luck.
Oh, Russ, we can't hear you.
You are not muted, but we can't hear you for some reason. Still can't.
I'm going to turn on a light. I'll be right back.
I guess it's maybe a browser permission. You've got it figured out, yeah. Russ, would you like me to go around and have everyone introduce themselves? Yeah, and you can refresh the tab or whatever. This turn it off and turn it back on again. These great technical solutions that we have to all of these challenges. So why don't I go first? My name is Kirstie. I did a PhD in brain imaging in California, which is where I sort of discovered that I don't trust the vast majority of the brain imaging literature because I don't think it is very reproducible or applicable, all of the stuff that a lot of folks think about and talk about here. I then did a postdoc at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Psychiatry there, and I looked at brain imaging development again. And then I was very fortunate to receive a fellowship, a research fellowship, to work at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. And I sort of turned up there with a mission to make sure that everything that the Turing Institute published was reproducible. And I am there 5 years later. It is a laughable goal to imagine that we would make everything reproducible. But I do get motivated regularly by saying, if the National Institute for Data Science can't do it, then no one can do it. And that's an interesting both like high and low inside of the same sentence. And now I work there. I lead a research program in called Tools, Practices, and Systems, which is specifically around investing in open infrastructure. Aki, why don't I hand the mic to you?
Sure. So my name is Nikoladis. I'm currently a research scientist at the Child Mind Institute. I am also the chair of the Open Science Special Interest Group at OHBM. I kind of got interested in open science in a similar way, actually, as what Kirstie was describing. So my PhD was in cognitive training. So how can we use tasks and video games to train people on those tasks and video games, and then can we see some kind of concomitant like plasticity in the brain that goes along with that, right? And so this field of cognitive training is like rife with all sorts of different issues about how the replication crisis ended up coming. And Dan Simons was at University of Illinois when I was there, and he and I like talked a lot, and so I didn't really believe how bad it could be back in 2011. So I was like, no, I have so much faith in science and what we're doing. We're building a book of human knowledge, yada, yada, yada. So, and then a few years later, I did a postdoc for a bit at Child Mind Institute, and then I've been there since, focusing on, which is a nonprofit. So it's also a different academic space. So kind of similar to Kirstie, not in the traditional like lab structure. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Vittorio, should I pass it off to you?
Okay. Hello. So for those who never met me, my name is Vittorio Iacovella. I work as a hand-waving technician. Let's say I'm a technician, but my main focus is open science for Think Open at CIMMEC, which is an open science initiative of CIMMEC, which is the Center for Mind and Brain Sciences at the University of Trento in Italy. I have this kind of position since 2 years, but I was a postdoctoral researcher back until 2015. My main focus was at that time informatics, or let's say IT for neuroimaging. Was lucky enough to spend 3 months at Michael Hanke lab back in those days when they were in Magdeburg, and I grew interest in open science. 1 year later, I actually understood, after reading an interesting commentary that I would put in the chat, which was called The Future of Postdoc, I understood that I wanted to work in a science environment, but I didn't want to do plain research. So I switched to IT support. And what I've seen in those years as an IT, like doing help desk for researcher working in neuroimaging, was that what was once sort of like my lateral curiosity, like open science, was growing and becoming sort of like sort of the conceptual and technical infrastructure of the science to come. So 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to transform what was part of my everyday job routine as into my main focus. And that's it, basically.
I just want to check and see if you can actually hear me now.
Yes.
Cool.
Oh, okay.
Sal, did you introduce yourself yet?
Yeah, I'll go real quick. So I guess my background is very similar. I was obviously in neuroimaging, and so I got here. My PhD was between National Institutes of Mental Health and University College London, back and forth. But I think I differ a little bit in that while I was doing the PhD, I built this MOOC, this online course called the Online Brain Intensive. Quite a few of you were involved in it. And then I almost immediately stepped out of that into industry and transitioned from open science to open source, and have built a really, really interesting career out of that, and got to work with thousands and thousands of really, really smart people in that. But glad to be here and to hear about the issues that are still going on here. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for everybody for joining. Sorry about my technical difficulties. So I'm Russ Poldrack. I'm a professor at Stanford, and I've come from the neuroimaging world and been trying to do open science for a long time, sometimes succeeding. So we're going to basically go around. I have a couple questions we're going to start by having each of you respond to. And so I'm just going to go in the order that you're on my screen. So we'll start with Aki. And so the first question is, what have been the most important benefits and or challenges of doing open science for your career so far?
I would say probably the biggest challenge has been, I come from more of like a psychology background, and realizing the depth of technical acumen required to operate at the high level that my colleagues in open science were operating at was overwhelming, to say the least at the beginning. And I'd say another big challenge has been sort of the day-to-day, like existential struggle of like, if open science doesn't work, then does science work? And if I can't do, I'm just like, should I just quit? What should I, should I just, I don't know, start an ice cream shop or something like that? Just something, just really whatever, I don't have to think about all this stuff all the time. Benefit-wise, I would say science for me before getting involved in open science was a bit of like a lone wolf thing, where I just had my projects and I worked on them because I wasn't funded by my lab. I was always funded by like some grant or something like that I applied for. So I never had any like reason to be like day in, day out with a group of people. So I felt kind of alone a lot. And I've just found this amazing community of like passionate, enthusiastic, reform and activism oriented people. And it's, just, I don't know. Yeah, it's that. I would say that's easily been the best thing for me.
Cool. Great. Thanks. Kirstie.
Yeah, I sort of plus one everything that Aki said. I agree with all of those. And I think my answer is super, super cheesy, and I didn't think about editing it, but I'm going to just keep it because it really is true. So the biggest benefit about building a career around open science, I think, is because I truly believe I am doing work that will change the world into a more positive and inclusive space. Like I feel like everyone should probably wake up in the morning and feel that what they're doing is the most important thing. And hopefully like the vision for the world is that everybody's version of that is slightly different. So the world gets better, like you move that sort of space forwards in lots of different dimensions. But I really sort of, the way that I sort of talk about my career is that I really loved looking at brain networks. Like I loved structural brain development. I still sort of have an intention of getting a tattoo of like a myelinated axon at some point. Like I think that would be super, super fun. And I really enjoy doing the thinking around that. But I sort of could see these bigger problems that were kind of limiting the success for so many. And so I kind of, on the benefit side, I think getting up in the morning, my current job is that it's my responsibility to land £1 million grants and funding to pay people to contribute into open source projects, not just in neuroscience, in fact, very little, sadly, in neuroscience, but in lots of different fields. So in sort of environmental science or in like finance and economics. We've got health projects. We've been working on COVID related projects. We think about sort of advising government policy. Like I sort of, it's my responsibility to get money into that system to improve it across the board. So my benefit is like, I really cheesily, I really think I'm doing work that I think will have a really positive impact very broadly and have a long legacy. And I think the downside of that is like, it's a really big challenge, everyone. Like it's sort of the way in which you change the world is you just kind of chip away at it to the extent that you are able, and then you hope that there's a whole movement of people that come along behind you who keep that change going. So measuring my success is sort of close to impossible because all I can see are all the things that I've not yet succeeded on. But I think the kind of the purpose and the goal is what keeps me going.
Cool, thanks. Sal.
Yeah, so I think the thing that really impacted me the most with open science is, honestly, it's really specifically technical. I think it was when I discovered, I think this is 2016 or 2017, when I ran this course, people were getting different results when testing the same hypothesis, right? And that just shouldn't happen. Math is math, right? Turns out that's not true. So there are so many factors, and I think I've always been obsessed with the idea, right? It's why I was working on real-time neuroscience, trying to capture brains in real time. It's because I'm really, really fascinated about using machines to learn what the state of the world is when I'm solving a problem. That's what an MLE does. That's what you all do, right? You're just focusing on the brain regions. But how can we do that if we can't trust even sometimes the machines and the infrastructure that we're functioning over? And so, this is not a problem that is, just in this open science domain, right? This is the kind of advisement that I've had to give to the US Air Force, for example, to tell them about the reliability of the systems that they're using. And I think that we're at this like really, really, really cool place right now where we finally have enough, like we can crunch CPUs and get answers to questions from massive data sets that we couldn't get before. But I want people to understand how to do that intelligently, to share their data in a way that makes sense. So I think it taught me to be a skeptic, and that made me an incredibly good engineer. And I think that that's a skill set you get out of doing this. So,
cool, thanks, Vittorio.
Yes, so for me, I think it's pretty straightforward to enumerate the benefit of open science for my career, because no open science, no career for me. So it's pretty easy to say that open science made me a sort of progress in my career. Just to expand a little bit, in any case, on a more broad, from a broader point of view, I would say that back in those days when I was facing the problem of trying to build a career in science, the fact that there was this kind of uncharted territory of open science, or something which was not completely, let's say, so there is no, let's say, a conventional role for open science support and stuff like this. So this helped me focusing on what I could do with my skills and my, let's say, doing the things that I like the most, and things that I am able to do in a better way to help other people. And this was possible because this role is still not that let's say official, or let's say scheduled in a systematic way. Challenges, I think, for someone coming from neuroimaging or research, I think the challenge here is to try to let's say tackle these intersections of many different fields, and it's really a matter of finding the correct words to speak with people coming from extremely different backgrounds with respect to yours. How can a person with a background, for example, in physics or neuroimaging, talk about work with a librarian and a lawyer. So you had to find the right words, and you always have to avoid explaining things and saying, okay, I'm the one with the technical skills, so please sit there and listen to me, and so on and so forth, because those are the people who can really make your career and your knowledge and your let's say attitude with respect to the scientific and working environment grow up in a relevant way. So this kind of the most relevant challenge, but at the same time the most interesting, I think, benefit of this kind of career is getting acquainted with the people whom you thought you would have never met, with very different background, and try to speak with them. It's the challenge and the most amazing thing I experienced so far in this career.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I want to sort of touch back on one thing that Aki mentioned, this kind of like the challenge of, and it's definitely something that I've both experienced myself and I've really seen in a lot of trainees, is like, once you start going down the road of thinking that things are broken, it becomes very easy to just become completely nihilistic and think like everything is broken, and kind of finding a way to psychologically stick in a place where you're hopeful yet slightly cynical is really hard. And I think that's a tough challenge for everybody. Cool. Okay, so the next question is, what do you think the most important things are for an early career researcher to know or to do as they develop their career doing open science? We'll start again with Aki.
That's a really hard question. I would say I don't know. Feel free to disagree with me on this. Just like don't kill yourself to be a scientist. Like this is like a thing that, when I was in graduate school at University of Illinois, it was this like silo, right? It was like just me and other scientists and engineers, and it was like, oh, these are the people who are like doing good in the world, and like, I just want to be a scientist like them and contribute, and I just desperately want to do this thing. And moving to New York, I just kind of was like, oh, like science is so on the sidelines. Like, there's so much amazing work that's happening today that people are doing that are changing people's lives. And like, this is like a weird way of saying like, this is how you should go in open science, but like, go into open science being okay to leave science. And that I'm like, I feel so bad saying that, but like, I just want to say like 2% or 5% or something like that of people who go in science end up in tenure track jobs. The main path is into industry or out of science. So don't burden yourself. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just like, go in, it's a learning experience, learn to code, learn to communicate clearly, learn to write well. Those are like the 3 things that I always try to like make sure my trainees and like other young researchers are getting. And if you get those, like, you're going to be fine, and you're going to have a, great career, even if it's not in science, specifically.
Kirstie?
That's such an awesome piece of advice. Like, don't have a career in science. But I really agree with that. And actually, I think I have sort of 2 pieces of advice. One is actually sort of what has many people on the panel have said, which is I think find your tribe. So the thing that's really nice about caring, if you're an early career researcher, the thing that's really, really nice about caring about open science is there really are lots of other people who feel the same way. And if you kind of interpret the open in open science as relating to inclusion or relating to collaboration, then you open these doors. Oh, I'm using it too much, but like you build these connections between all these different people. And actually, I think I found trying to have a career that was sort of following status quo advice very, very isolating. And I am someone who is not very productive if I'm not really aligned with what I'm trying to do. And so I think kind of it became much more motivating when I found my tribe, found the people that I wanted to learn from and learn with and build and create with. And then I think my other piece of advice is slightly sort of spicier, which is I think it's really, really important to kill your darlings. So you should, if you are trying to do something that's never been done before, almost by definition, that means all the people before you have not done that thing. And so they are not able to advise you. So hilariously, you can't listen to my advice on how to have a career in open science because you have to overtake me, right? You have to do better than everybody else who's come before you. And that is part of the constant change.
Cool, thanks. Sal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really good question. I mean, as far as hard skills go, actually get good at Python. Just learn it, do it. Get yourself a GitHub repository and contribute to that 3 times a week. Figure it out, right? Show a record of doing real work. And that's going to be a benefit to you whether or not you stay in academia. I also think it's interesting. I think that there's going to be, and this is absolutely speculative, I think there's going to be a shift where we're going to see the traditional, what you would say, postdoc, right? That function as it has existed in academia really isn't lining up with like the cutting edge of neuroimaging, absolutely, but anything that really underlines machine learning, right? You kind of have to go into industry or leave that space because anyone that's going to train you in academia is probably about 10 years behind what real cutting edge is. So we're probably going to see an influx of people in the next sort of 10 years rejoining academia and sort of adding in superpowers, but you, again, kind of do have to leave in order to get that. Now, a great way to have the balance of that is doing open science. And I want to speak to that sort of inclusion and the way that open science flips the traditional paradigm on its head. One of the things that I really didn't enjoy about academia is how clout-oriented it is in order to progress in your career. Now, I specifically have problems with that because I had a lot of early career success, and I had a lot of grants that gave me access to rooms that I never, ever, I believe, would have been invited into. I can tell you that because repeatedly, right, I was the only person of my type in those rooms, right? So funding is going to very specific demographics, very specific type of people. And I think we understand that that does not correlate to intelligence and it doesn't correlate to good science. And when you flip it on its head and you do open science and you make reproducibility, you make the translatability of your work clear, it broadens it so more people can see it, can interact with it, can find the value extracted from it. But it also makes sure that, right, it begins to level the playing field and make it so that it genuinely is the value of the information produced that has the cloud of clout around it. It should not be so individually biased. So yeah, I think those are the 2 things that I think are really, really fascinating to watch. And it's why I do keep a close eye on seeing how I think the state of science and the way that we train and educate in this area is going to have to evolve. So.
Perfect, thanks. Vittorio.
I think it's very hard to add something to this observation. Basically, many of the things I thought about, they already said. I just want to, let's say, stress the fact that earning what we could label as open science skills, even if they are like science skills, it's a good thing in any case, because either you'll become, let's say, a researcher, or you work as a researcher support, or you just leave research and go to big data company or start your own company or whatever. Some skills, they would, in any case, be mandatory for your progress. So you're never losing time if you're, let's say, learning a programming language, or let's say studying the general data protection regulation or stuff like this. I would add just something which is a bit different, which relates to, let's say, the environment that I found for example, in the Open Science Room last year, this year. So suppose that if you're an early career researcher and you're here, for example, in Open Science Room, you see that there is an environment which is inclusive, which is totally against prestige. No one cares about your provenance, which was your university, and so on and so forth. So this should not be, let's say, an open science thing. This should be like something of every scientific environment. So an advice could be, once you hang around in the Open Science Room and so on, and you feel good, you feel, let's say, you hang around in an environment which is inclusive, where it's safe to fail and discuss and so on and so forth. If you find yourself stuck in another environment which is not that safe, which is not that good, I'm not saying that it's toxic, but it's let's say somewhere where you don't feel that good, just remember that let's say it's not good, let's say, and this should be the way in which scientists create environments, and it's not, let's say, a sort of an impossible things to build, because open science movement already created and it's here. So if you find yourself stuck in an environment which you don't find really good for yourself, just think that another kind of approach to science is possible, and it's already here.
Cool, thanks. So this has been a really great panel. We're not getting kicked out because there's nothing in the room right after us, so we can certainly have a little more discussion. You know, I wanted to just reflect on all of your answers and say, you know, from my perspective, and I obviously coming from the perspective of someone who has survived and, like, you know, made it, if you believe Peter principle, basically made it to the point where I'm incompetent, right? You know, I think that it's important to keep in mind two things. One is, you know, as I think Pradeep noted in the commentary, you know, listening to advice from people who have made it, you know, to high levels is probably not going to necessarily be that helpful for you, right? In part because we all make it in our own way, and a lot of it is just random. You know, it's basically many different forms of quote unquote luck. Like some of those are like actual randomness. Some of them are like, you know, the luck of the genetic lottery or whatever other lotteries we happen to win or lose in life, right? At the same time, so obviously, you know, there's, I think you know, if this is something you want to do with your life, you basically have to just have faith that and confidence in, you know, in your vision and just do your best at it, but also be, you know, realize that, you know, that it is sort of like, you know, getting that academic position is also a bit like a lottery, right? And so if you don't win it, it's not necessarily because you're a, you know, because of a personal failing. It's because you didn't happen to like hit the right lotto number. You know, I also want to reflect on the fact that I think, you know, it's become really popular on Twitter to like trash on academia and how horrible academia is. And I know that there are like really bad outcomes for some people in academia, but I think it's too easy to think that like academia is a horrible place because of a relatively small number of people on Twitter who gripe really loud about it. And so I hope that people won't be dissuaded only by those voices. I think, you know, certainly listen to those voices, but try to listen to a broader set of voices and get a more balanced view of, you know, sort of what academia is like. So I don't know if there are other comments anybody on the panel wants to make, or other questions from the audience.
Well, I mean, I've got a thought that I would kind of like to chime in on, and it does, I mean, I think it's for that early career scientist, but beyond that, I think, right, it sort of got to that main point of like, why are you doing that work? What skills do you aim to develop? And I think what really helped me is, I think genuinely, when I took a step back and stopped identifying as a neuroscientist and identified as a professional problem solver doing neuroscience, that flipped my frame on what I was working on and how I was developing my skills. And it made me a better neuroscientist, absolutely, because it helped me to think more generally about the problems that we were solving. And again, right, to find what is, I mean, if the biggest problem is the infrastructure layer, not the math, let's focus on there. If that's where the real problem is right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been a really cool panel.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's actually a question in the Q&A that I'll read, which is an interesting one. What do you think would happen to your field of research if grant funding was suddenly stopped? Do you think this is a problem? And if so, what do you think would be a solution? Anyone have thoughts on that?
So I can.
Does anyone have any? Oh, sorry,
I
Kirstie.
can.
I wanted a clarification.
Oh, go for it.
Don't
Do the
really
clarification.
What do you think exactly that means? Like grant funding is stopped. That means like government is not funding anything, or
that would be my reading of it. Yeah, that basically PIs stop getting government grants or foundation grants to fund their work.
Go ahead, Kirstie.
Yeah, so this is something that kind of, I said that like my job now is for me to bring in millions of pounds worth to fund sort of research and innovation projects. And I think that if there's truly no one that wants to take on this space, there's no one that wants to put sort of any research and development industry style money behind your research question, there's two possible outcomes. One is that it's not actually a very interesting or useful research question. You've gone like really far down like a little narrow niche, and that's kind of sad but possibly true. Or you sort of pull on that thread that I think Aki got us started on, which is like all of our like government infrastructure falls apart, right? So like if you really don't actually invest in basic research that isn't immediately directly applicable, there's lots and lots of sort of chaos that ensues. So I think kind of what was the phrasing on the question? It was like, do we think it's a problem and what do we think would be the solution? So I feel like, yes, it is a problem if we truly took it to that catastrophic space. Now, I think maybe a more realistic aspect is we have PhD students that come and learn to do PhDs in data science and artificial intelligence and all of the various different sort of applied domains that relate to that. And their most promising prospects are to go next door to us when we're not working remotely to DeepMind. And you can get paid about 4 times as much as you would get paid as a postdoc, and you would almost certainly do more interesting artificial intelligence work at DeepMind. And there's lots and lots of other spaces where you could be doing that. And so for me, the real crux of this question is sort of saying, why are we doing this research and who is funding it and for what purpose? Because Google spend billions of pounds on DeepMind work because they know that it has a financial gain that's coming in the future. Like whether they sort of spend time solving generalized AI or whether they find time, building sort of machine learning, natural language processing models, or if they are inspired by neural networks that are like actually sort of biologically informed or cognitive models, they are investing all of this money because it will come into something later. And so I would say, I think actually it's less of a problem than people think. I think that it would get mopped up. It would just look quite different. The work would look different, but I don't think that if the research has a real meaning to it, if it's well justified, I think there would be funds that would come in. We just have to look at who we were consolidating power within.
Great. So I don't want to, go on too long here, but there's one more question that I think is a good one from Stephanie Noble. For those of us ECRs interested in increasingly contributing to open science, especially building and promoting better methods, I'm expecting there may be unanticipated challenges we may specifically face as we transition to the faculty level. If so, are there strategies that have worked for you to persist? And I want to highlight one particular challenge here, which is really the challenge for people who a substantial part of their career focuses on methods, right? Because when departments go to hire a faculty member, be they a neuroscience department or psychology department or whatever, they generally are looking for somebody who's focused on a scientific question, not necessarily somebody who spends a lot of their time developing methods. And I've certainly seen this with people in my group who've struggled to find people whose work focused on, methods, have struggled to find faculty positions because they don't fit anywhere, right? So I'm interested to see if there's any thoughts on this particular question.
I would like to jump in a little bit on this because I was focusing on methods in the work that I was doing. I think I can't speak to the faculty level. I obviously can't, but I think anyone that has been working in base signal processing, right? That's what we do in imaging. I think there's just, again, I'm going to broaden it out. Like, really do consider industry and consider coming back to academia. If you're getting to that point of burnout, or if you're seeing, right, if you're not seeing the kind of opportunities that would really get you to that next step. And then I think you can jump back in. It's not as if these data sets dry up. And in fact, I was working, right, it's not as if you're never going to touch a neuroimaging data set again. I think that's sort of the fear people have when they're leaving academia, that they're like never going to be working on problems that they're passionate about. But it's absolutely untrue. You get freed up to be able to choose the kind of problems that you want to solve. And like to this degree of, right, grants not coming in, yeah, sometimes things will get reformatted. I was just working with a company that has access to all of the data coming in from 25 NHS centers, including but not limited to brain imaging data, right? Incredible opportunity to go out, flex your skill sets, and make a magnitude difference than you could in that like isolated postdoc.
I think the one caveat there is you need to be in an industry position where you can publish, right? Because that's going to be the coin of the realm. And if you really wanted to go back into academia, you have to have been, you have to have that currency to spend on that job, right? Aki, did you have a comment as well?
Yeah, I got into neuroscience because I started meditating a lot, and I was observing how my brain was changing, and that is why I kind of am a neuroscientist. I want to know how the brain changes. But then I eventually got to the point where I was like, we don't know what the hell we're doing, so I want to figure out what the reliability of the signal is. And I think that you can use that kind of story to sell back to the original topic, right? You can kind of say like, I'm really passionate about brain plasticity, but this and this and this is kind of preventing us from being able to understand how brain plasticity works, for example. And I've developed this method, or I've addressed this issue that will, maximize our capability, or make it so that instead of needing 1,000 people to do a study, we only need 500 people to do the same effective study, or something to that extent. Now, I'm not saying that I've been able to do that necessarily, but that's kind of like part of how I think about it, is trying to figure out how you can marry back your methodological advancements and sell it back to the community and be like, see, this is something that is valuable for us.
Yeah, I think that's great. Cool. All right. Well, we should probably call it here. So let's give a hand to all of our panelists, and thank you all for being so engaged on the Q&A and the chat as well.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone in the chat.
Thanks. Bye.